And welcome to Uniquely Sociology, a podcast production of the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Ramon Hinojosa. Uniquely Sociology is a podcast that explores the research and creative efforts of those that are doing the good work of sociology. You want to know what sociology is and what contribution sociology makes to improving our lives? Well, then you've come to the right podcast. It's Uniquely Sociology. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Angela Vergara, a full-time lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Vergara's teaching and research specializes in social inequalities, reproductive health, and the sociology of mental illness. She is also a newly minted member of the Citizen Science GIS and GeoBus team, a project that is supported by grant funding for the National Science Foundation. So hello and welcome, Dr. Vergara.
Hello, Dr. Hinojosa. Very, very excited and happy to be here with all of you today.
So let's begin by asking you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself. Where and when did you attend school and get your PhD, and what was your dissertation about?
Okay, yes. So I attended school at the University of Central Florida. I'm actually a twice alumni for here. My bachelor's in psychology is from UCF. And then I came back after my master's to University of Central Florida for my PhD in sociology. Graduated summer 2020, right in the midst of all the intense stuff that happens to everyone. And I was very fortunate to have been able to stay as a visiting lecturer and now newly minted full-time lecturer in the department.
Excellent. And so as a newly minted lecturer, what sort of courses do you teach here in sociology?
So I started teaching a lot of just core courses, specifically a research methods data analysis. So that was a great experience, not only while doing my own dissertation, which was on a Puerto Rican population and those who were displaced by Hurricane Maria in 2016. So pretty much people who have to move to specifically the Central Florida area. So I explore all aspects of that move, not only in terms of language barrier, education, social support, but the overarching themes that I was looking for or that we explore was mental health and the effects of mental health and whether this process is affected positively or negatively, because there were positive effects that were found on individuals and the family, if it was a family structure who migrated. So that started kind of my teaching specialty and career through race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, all these social factors. And I concentrated in Hispanic Latinx population and like the different needs associated with the Hispanic Latinx population, especially the very interesting and very unique factors that not only affect but represent those of us, and me as a Latina woman, Hispanic Latinx population, that is not just one homogenous community. We have very, very unique differences within our own culture and population that makes a difference in the way not only we're perceived by the majority, but the way we perceive ourselves and each other. So that's the application. And then the research methods data analysis capstone courses for every undergraduate that graduates with that sociology degree. And that's just guiding them to the process of research, whether quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, apply projects that could be turned into research methods. And that was very rewarding. And it still is a very rewarding experience to continue to mentor students from point A, from a question to point B, a finalized research proposal, or even a full manuscript.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you're really involved with the educational process here for graduate students and undergraduate students here in sociology. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. And in terms of, it led to a lot of independent studies from students that wanted to explore more of their findings. Also, I'm very transparent about my identities. I always say my identities will walk first into the classroom, whether sometimes you want it or not. So I'm very transparent about not only being a Latina woman, but also being a cisgender, heterosexual woman within the United States, but also being an immigrant from Colombia. I was not born and raised here. I was born and raised in Colombia, South America. So those different factors, language proficiency, English is my second language. So I'm very transparent in terms of my teaching and teaching the way we do research to kind kind of include the different factors that come into play when those identities come together within the educational institution. So it was a great connection, not only for students who kind of have the same identities as I do, but students who do not and were just curious to learn. As in, like, I had no idea, that, for example, English is your second language, but how does this happen? Or I had no idea that, naturalization in the United States takes more than 15 years. I thought immigration's where it just happens, right? So it's also opened up a lot of conversations with students from all walks of life, not just Hispanic, Latinx, and our specific needs.
Excellent. So if we could go back to your dissertation research a little bit. Now, you had mentioned that because of Hurricane Maria, there was a large displaced Puerto Rican population that ended up moving to Central Florida. And if I think I heard you correctly, you said there were some positive effects in there. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about what some of those positive effects were, and perhaps if there were negative effects as well.
Sure, yes, and it was an interesting finding. So pretty much the background for my dissertation was I happened to had just gotten my graduate teaching assistant position. So the first class that I taught on my own face to face was an introduction to sociology class on spring 2017. And when Hurricane Maria happened and universities was closed, the university opened for waive tuition, just come in and continue your education here at UCF in Orlando. So in my class, there happened to be a significant number. Anytime you have one group of people, 15 or more, it's significant in our classes, of Puerto Rican students who have come from university and usually sophomore or junior level, and realized I need introductory courses here at UCF. So they took my intro to sociology class. And what ended up happening, this relationship in the classroom that opened my eye to this unique needs of the Puerto Rican population, was that the students will come to me after class and ask in well-spoken English, but say, hey, so you said you speak Spanish fluently. Is there a way that we could have a conversation in Spanish so I could process this, this sociological concepts, sociological imagination, variables, like all this teaching, because I understand what you're saying, but I don't understand what you're saying. So that was that cultural barrier rather than a language barrier. So there was that unique opportunity to not only I ended up teaching sociology and Spanish, on the side in office hours, they come as a group. So that was also helped me understand kind of like the mental gymnastics you have to do. My PhD and all my graduate degrees are from the United States, undergraduate, including high school and even 1 year middle school. So there's things that we learn in English, but then we go back to say it in Spanish. We're like, wait a minute, what's that? How do you say it? Hold on, let me just back up. So that led me to look at kind of the stress factors. So when the dissertation came about, it was open to all people who have been displaced, have come to the United States, especially Central Florida. There was a unique also that people who landed at MCO, they have tables in both English and Spanish. This is if you need housing, if you need any type of forms, if you need medication, if you need healthcare. So while interviewing and while researching, and then I had secondary interviews and looking at these factors, it was surprising to see positive factors in terms of effect on mental health. And those positive factors are, there were people who thought, well, I'm in the United States now. This is the land of opportunity. So any kind of negative effect or displacement, so you're living in transitional housing, it's very much, well, it's worth it. We got to get it through because we're here and we have this opportunity. Positive factors for students was the ability to be able to continue their education, because a lot of them talked about that their biggest fear when everything happened was losing their track on graduating on time. So even though as a psychologist myself and practicing psychologist, I'm a trained therapist, I would hear in the language that they were saying things that I'm like, well, you're actually kind of talking about severe trauma there and chronic trauma. But as they're negotiating this traumatic events in their life in relationship to the opportunities and the positivity that they were finding here, I think it acted as a moderator and mediator for actual trauma to be triggered. So that was a positive factor. Definitely factors like social support. So there was huge difference between people who came here with knowing anybody and never have been in the US versus those who did. Language barriers, if you spoke English, even if it's Spanglish, there was more positivity there. And once again, with student population, even though a lot of them came here by themselves, just to move into special dorms, the community that they created, they will call it like, oh, it's like pequeño Puerto Rico. It's like, I feel like I never left my university. Like I found my people, we're listening to Puerto Rican music, we had the flag, we did croqueta. So it was very much about, I was able to transfer my culture, and that was very positive factors, even though these are individuals that from the outside looking in, without the cultural knowledge and looking at psychology specifically, you will say that's trauma. We're gonna have to check. Let's check for PTSD. Let's check for anxiety and depression. Let's check for effects on everyday life. But that protective factor, almost like that bubble of their culture being able to transfer here and having that social support, that was a form of social capital that really acted as a barrier for the activation of severe mental health factors and issues and problems here.
Well, that's quite interesting. So sociology provides the lens to be able to look at not just individuals and individual trauma, but also the structure in which that trauma takes place. And if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like the structure of home in some ways was recreated here at UCF on campus, and perhaps in the Orlando community in a way that helped those displaced by Hurricane Maria become more resilient and help them get through the trauma.
Correct. Yes, that is definitely what I saw. So through my sociology training, my sociological training, but also my psychological training, it just makes it made this complete picture. So I will say I am a better psychologist because I am a sociologist, and vice versa. Because one of the things that as psychologists, especially those of us who work with trauma, that someone like me who has this expertise will argue, well, not everything is a trauma disorder. There are protective factors, and culture comes into play. Language barriers comes into play, which interestingly enough, one of the negative factors that come into play that might produce false negatives when analyzing trauma markers, especially in the Hispanic Latinx population, and in this particular case for the Puerto Rican population after Hurricane Maria, as a culture, Hispanics are very much Catholic, Roman Catholic, and anything we say or do, even when you're a practicing Catholic or you grow older and you get introduced to other forms of religion, a lot of our language is very God-based and prayer-based. So that was another one of the arguments that I want to expand on in the future with research of how just because someone's saying, I'm fine, I'm okay, it's God's will, I'm a survivor, anything that happens, God will never abandon me, loosely translated into English, and in Spanish, it sounds a lot more passionate. That cultural understanding might not translate, and you might go, oh, this person is fine. When in reality, you start tracking those language and the words, and how, for example, when you ask them physically, how did they feel as this was happening? So one of the questions we have, what happened during the hurricane? And then you compare the after. So the language after is very much religious, like we were fine, God had us in, we were praying, God had us in their hands, we're survivors. But when they physically explain the during, it is a specific markers, anxiety, heart palpitation, tachycardia, couldn't sleep for 48 hours, couldn't eat for 48 hours. Water will get stuck here. Holding back their tears for their children, so motherhood was a factor too. So then you start looking at those biomarkers and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is heightened states that are traumatic in nature. But when you take at their word for it is, oh no, they're fine, religious, it is a protective factor. But in the Hispanic community, we tend to have, when we speak in Spanish, especially about any type of celebration or death or any that's negative or positive, our language, Spanish, is very much surrounded around being a survival and very religious in nature. So that creates a barrier for other people to kind of read beyond those lines and see, well, let's think about the physical part, and there might be trauma there. So that was interesting too. And that was one of the negative factors that, so especially if they were mothers and had small children. So motherhood was definitely a factor in terms of trauma, higher levels of trauma. Even if they did not report any trauma, the way, we would ask questions like, okay, so if this is happening and you haven't eaten for 24 hours and you're in fear that your roof is about to just take off, where were your children? And they're like, well, I just kept them in this room playing, and I came smiling, and it was really hard, and I felt like bursting into tears, and like my chest was gonna burst, but I was just smiling and trying to make tea and coffee and bread for them so they wouldn't see that how bad it could be. So that kind of expanded that traumatic, because not only you are going to highly traumatic events, but you're not processing it as it happening and after. So that has the potential to create this like perfect storm down the road.
And not to mention that it sounds like these mothers are worried about their children, but yet have to put on a brave face to make sure that the children perhaps aren't as affected by some of the traumatic things happening outside the house, like the storm that was ripping the roof off.
Yes, yes. So that had an effect, that had the potential of emotional regulation down the road. And then there's this place, and there's no social support, lack of social capital here. Then you have language barriers, because also the assumption that those who are born in Puerto Rico, they speak English as Puerto Rican citizens, but actually they don't. It's a Spanish speaking country. And also the racism they experience here as seen as immigrants from another country. That dual reaction to we're citizens, but no, you're not, because you don't speak English. So there was that double-edged sword too, that all those factors come into play and are compounded, and especially for mothers. That was one of the biggest in the narratives. You hear that if they were mothers with small children, the trauma markers were there.
And so what will you go on to do with your dissertation work? Have you published pieces of this? Have you presented on work? Do you have articles in the works right now on the basis of this?
Yes, so 2 pieces are in the work in separate factors. One is kind of pretty much looking at community analysis and geographical location and the effect on acculturation, assimilation, and specific to that community is obviously specifically survivors of Hurricane Maria, especially those who had to move from Puerto Rico and come here. And then another one, kind of in the works in terms of, I want to concentrate on motherhood as a reproductive justice framework. That reproductive justice, motherhood as a compounding factor in, especially in trauma, accessibility, and all the different accesses necessary, and building social capital, because that's what they had difficulty doing. Also building, even when they got here, building social capital, and then they're already with this heightened emotional state. So those 2 pieces are in the work. So I had to put a pin on the mental health factor from my psychology side, just because it was a combination of personal interviews and secondary data. So to be able to argue these factors for a dissertation, it just makes it a little bit difficult. So, but that's one of the things that I want to push forward again, just start that specific markers and actually have interview in general, not just Puerto Rico, but Hispanic Latinx population, in terms of kind of really understanding how PTSD works and its form, and it's perpetuated, and it affects Hispanic Latinx population, especially when your first language is Spanish. So even for Spanish speaking.
And
so that's the future project.
Okay. Well, I'm assuming that this work is related in some ways to your new position with the citizen science group and the GeoBus. And so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that and how that came to be.
Yes, I'm very excited. Just my mentoring and, student mentoring and just leading them through the process and just understanding these factors. Very fortunate who have had to talk to Dr. Hawthorne several times about like this community differences, these nuances that sometimes as researchers, we want to go into communities, we see the whole, this is the factors that we want to study. And my part of it, it's always question, well, like there are nuances there. Just because they're eliciting this behavior, it doesn't mean that it match this particular
And
understanding of that behavior.
if I could jump in here, Dr. Hawthorne is Dr. Timothy Hawthorne of the University of Central Florida here in sociology, and he is the leader of the citizen science group. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. And as a GIS expert, geographical informational systems, something that I didn't really study in depth during graduate school, but was kind of interested about, because it's part of like, yeah, if we can map out our community with this very specific factors, we start looking at nuances and understanding very different needs depending on subgroups. So that's how I became involved with Citizen GIS, and now hopefully going to Belize and in the next couple of summers. In terms of faculty mentors, so just getting the students, UCF students, not only let's propose the project and let's narrow down that, let's put it, not narrow down, but let's make sure that your research question is answerable, for example, is something you can do. Let's make sure we have variables, but then going to Belize and actually be part of the community, and just mentor the students and in conversation with others to have that understanding that as researchers, we can come in with a blank slate and look into it, but also we have to be aware that we're occupying their space and how to start understanding that relationship, that, yeah, it's okay to not maybe have seen that or experienced that behavior, especially from our Western US mentality, like, oh, that's so different of what we do. That's fine to have those culture shocks reaction, but why is it different from us? Why is it normal for them versus us? And then understanding those nuances. So I'm very excited to start this work with the Citizen GIS to start looking at these factors.
Excellent. And so you'd mentioned Belize a couple of times, and I presume that you were talking about the group that goes down with the citizen science research team, and they work in Belize to look at coastal settlements, coastal erosion. Yes. And so you're going to be a mentor for that component of this sort of transcultural research. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. Just a faculty mentor for the students there and support as a global inequalities and looking at the sex and gender factors, race and ethnicity factors, and kind of like a faculty mentor to look at the things that we love to look at sociologies and see what we learn.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, for our audience members out there, if you could point to an article or publication or a piece of creative work that really would give people a sense of the sort of work that you do as a sociologist, what would you say that would be?
Yes, I definitely have an article that was published last year. And it took 3.5 years to publish, as we know, because then COVID and everything. But it's an article that I worked. So when I started the work specifically as a reproductive justice expert, I was looking at breastfeeding practices in the Hispanic Latinx population. So there's a disconnect, for example, in terms, medical association, the American Medical Association says that breastfeeding is the best form of feeding for a child for at least a year. Especially newborn, it does have incredible medical and mental health outcomes when they become adult. So that's all documented. For the Hispanic Latinx population, especially if you have social capital, like your mom is there with you while you're giving birth, and then you have this generational kind of knowledge of motherhood and breastfeeding, is seen as a cultural, it's a no-brainer. But there's a disconnect in the United States where Black women are the most disenfranchised for having access to breastfeeding training and breastfeeding after 1 month. But Hispanic Latinx population, they usually either, especially mothers with their newborns, they stop breastfeeding by at least 3 months. So I found that data interesting because why? It's part of our cultural capital. As a Hispanic Latina woman, breastfeeding is what you do. So, and I did a content analysis on Instagram, on a social media researcher. I love using it. It's there, it's data, it's just finding the right pieces. And the other part of it, I started looking in Spanish, so a lot of words that do not translate directly. So breastfeeding is one of the few, there's a couple of Spanish language words that translate directly. So you don't have to do the mental gymnastics to explain between the two languages. So breastfeeding translates to amamantar. And also, but that's the colloquial Hispanic Latina way of saying it. The kind of educational medical way of saying it is lactancia or lactar, which is lactation. So it's quite scientific and very like dry in nature and very medical, like almost like a medical procedure or something. So I started looking at Instagram as these two hashtags in Spanish and see what kind of posts appear. So the first thing that happened, it turned out to be a global project because through the beauty of geotags and people could tag where they at, it's different countries. So that's what expanded kind of the project, especially Latin America, Central America, and Spain. Definitely Latin America. So I started looking at South America, Central American countries, and Mexico. And what was interesting that I started finding, even though all the posts were in Spanish, amamantar and lactancia showed up, if it was an educational component to the post, as in breastfeeding practices, just we'll teach you how to do it, let's talk about it, or like breastfeeding ins, they call it, if that translated well. But the amamantar appear in women or mothers kind of calling, and they actually call it a brealfie, which is a selfie while breastfeeding or about to breastfeed, or if you have a newborn. So that it's a very much representation of motherhood. But what was interested is that most of the posts that were educational, that meant to reach out Latinas in Central America and South America for breastfeeding practices, it follow a very much a white European visual mentality that did not represent specifically or especially Afro-Latinos, mestizos, mulatas. So this different kind of diverse racial component that we have. And that was a little bit of a disconnect. So that's one of the findings, how even though the Instagram as an accessible, democratic, quote unquote, information is there, it's for you to take it, and we post what we want. When it had to do around breastfeeding practices, it was very much associated not only with this white European vision of what a good mother looks like, so representation, but also visually who had access to it. So we didn't find very few posts with like native indigenous women or rural women. So that created, in terms of social capital again, and as a sociologist, you look at that and you're saying, well, we're catering to those in the know. And it's perpetuating inequality to those who might need it the most in terms of resources and in terms of understanding and language and knowledge and access to those rural areas. And then also perpetuating this idea of perfect motherhood. So very slim, very light skin, flowy hair, wide eyes woman, as in like breastfeeding is this beautiful spiritual practice. And those who are mothers will tell me that that's not how it looks. The breastfeeding a newborn, it is not a model, or it is not this perception of perfection of motherhood. So there was that finding, and then also disconnect in education processes. But another interesting finding was women who will post things like breastfeeding at work, breastfeeding in the classroom, breastfeeding in public spaces, the whole deal about cover yourself up, for example, like you can't breastfeed in public. And they were just, jokes about it. So one that I remember the most, because that started this category, was a woman has a picture and she's breastfeeding and she has a towel over her head and she's in a public restaurant. And the caption says, both in English and Spanish, they asked me to cover up, so I did. And then hashtag breastfeeding. So that was one kind of like a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, it's natural, we're all eating, and this is a newborn. So also the disconnect between, you're saying that breastfeeding is the best practice for a year, but there are not structures in place for women to actually participate in their everyday life while continue breastfeeding. So that is one article and research process that I'm very proud of, that I want to continue on with other things that came out that I want to explore down the road. And then the power of Instagram, because it was the visual content analysis of what was there, relationship with their captions, and relationship with the global community and how the global was perceived. So the most surprising finding for me was that you're expecting, if you're going to Colombia or if you're going to Ecuador and Peru, which are higher like indigenous communities, you're going to see posts that represent the communities. And that was not the case at all.
Interesting. So it's very
So
much
that was
about,
very interesting. Yeah.
so it's about who's represented, whose image is represented in these posts, and what that says about the accessibility of the information that is available in these posts as well.
Correct. And it's a barrier to healthcare,
Mhm.
because it's a barrier to healthcare for both mother and child. Because if we're not representing this communication well, we are losing the opportunity for an incredible healthcare access. And then if a woman has difficulty breastfeeding, they're much less likely to go ask for help, because there's this visuals of like, well, you're a mom, you should have known how to do it, right? Like women are born with this code in her head that says how, and it's not the case. So that's also a barrier to healthcare and other healthcare issues that might arise due to those difficulties or experiences with breastfeeding. Because also breastfeeding, I'm not a mother myself, but women that I interview who have been mothers, it's a very difficult thing, and it's quite difficult, invasive for the mother to participate in it. So this post also did not show kind of the truth, which in terms create barriers to access to healthcare for women who need help
Very
from the
interesting.
medical institution.
And so I think this work is an excellent example of how sociology really helps one to uncover the varying layers of the ways in which societies and norms shape things as fundamental as healthcare outcomes and healthcare access. And so in this instance, we've got representation, we have potential medical information, we've got information about newborn nutrition, and it's all sort of captured in this new technology of Instagram. That's very fascinating stuff. And for the audience, what I'd like to do is I'll put that article in the links below. And so please feel free to take a look at the study. I will give you a sense of what Dr. Vergara does and what sociology can do for our understanding of the social worlds that we live in. Dr. Vergara, I would like to thank you for taking your time today to speak with us. Unfortunately, we're getting close to time here, but I do appreciate your willingness to sit down and chat with the audience about the work that you do and how it fits into sociology.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Very excited to be able to talk about the work, and I'm very passionate about just bringing in those like, but wait, there's a lot more there. So I'm very excited about those things and very, very happy. So thank you very much for giving me the platform and the chance to be able to talk about it.
Absolutely. And maybe we can have you back at some point in the future to talk about your projects as they are ongoing. I would certainly love to have that happen.
I would love to. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd also like to thank you, our listening audience, for taking the time from your busy day to sit in as we discuss all things uniquely sociology. This is Dr. Ramon Hinojosa saying thank you, and we hope that you join us next week. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.